Well, I was going to ask you, what is wisdom? What is wisdom? This is something that we kind of hear a lot of, and there's always a joke about knowledge is knowing that a tomato is fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in your smoothie. Maybe you've heard that before. And my kids have heard it before, because I've said it before. But what is wisdom, biblically speaking? Is wisdom something that can be learned at school? Is it just about experience? What is wisdom? Well, there's a whole section of wisdom in the Old Testament here. We've been going through Ecclesiastes here, and Ecclesiastes, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Solomon, all of these things were classified by the ancient Hebrews as they looked to the divine gift that they'd been given in the word of the Lord, and they looked to these books and said, these are wisdom books. These impart wisdom for life. These are all about godly wisdom. But what type of wisdom are they seeking to give us? I've quoted a few times as we looked at Ecclesiastes here from another pastor, from long ago, that he told us that Psalms teach us how to worship, the Proverbs how to behave, Job how to suffer, Song of Solomon how to love, and Ecclesiastes how to live. And that's kind of a good breakdown of how to think about these things. But a lot of their messages there's a lot of crisscross and overlap about it, because they're all trying to teach us wisdom and how to live is basically what they all are about. And so what does that mean a lot here? What does all this mean to talk about wisdom and stuff? What does that mean? Well, this book began by starting us on this journey to find the answer to life and the universe and everything. What is the meaning of life? The most fundamental and the biggest question that we all ask, why am I here? And what is the point of everything? And we've been going on this journey. We've been seeing as it's been explored here. And you said, well, the answer is not found here and it's not found here. And he went through these things telling us where it's not found. But now as the book's starting to wind down, he turns from telling us all about where it's not found to start telling us where wisdom really is found. What is really the wisdom of life? It's not found in pursuing projects or diving into our work and seeking our whole meaning in all these things that are nothing but smoke and vapor and things like that. But true wisdom for living, true godly life, wisdom for a life under the sun in this world that we live, true wisdom here is found in some truths. And those truths begin to be explored here in this. And if you look at your insert, that's a big passage of Scripture. So don't be scared. We're going to do it a little bit differently than we normally do, because he kind of hits on some different ideas in this passage. And I wanted to kind of have all of this here, because he kind of says a lot of things a couple times. And it's kind of bookended with the same idea. And so we're going to explore these ideas that he has in here. There's a man named Scott Peck, and he wrote a book, and Gordy's already perking up, I'm sure. He loves that book, The Road Less Traveled. And he wrote this book, and it opens with this line, life is difficult. Life is difficult. And Peck could have written Ecclesiastes. Life is difficult. And he goes on, Peck, in this book, The Road Less Traveled, that this is a great truth, that life is difficult is a great truth. And perhaps one of the greatest truths. And he goes on in the rest there to tell us that this is something that we all kind of have to wrestle with, and we all kind of have to get a handle on, that life is difficult, and what that means for our life. And Ecclesiastes starts by not telling us life is difficult, but that life is vanity. It's all emptiness, and there's all this meaninglessness. And then goes to tell us about the difficulties of life. And this is a great truth. And there's great truth here, and it is perhaps one of the greatest truths. And no doubt that's why Ecclesiastes exists. That's why it's perhaps the most applicable book. It's something that I've looked at often in my life, because the truths and the reality that it talks about transcend just, the churchy life, but go beyond all of life, because it's about all of life under the sun. Everybody who lives under the sun, and in case you don't know, everybody you know lives under the sun. Unless you know some people from another solar system, but everybody you know lives under the sun. We all live in this world together. It's not just truths about church, but it's truths about real life under the sun. And so among a few other ideas, that's where today's passage kind of takes us. As today's passage, we're going to look at this. It's a long passage, But it kind of gets to a few basic ideas that wisdom of God is telling us here, at least in this passage here, that there's three kind of parts to living life under the sun. Godly wisdom and life under the sun kind of gives us three things. That life under the sun is unfair. That life under the sun is a mystery. But life under the sun is not everything that there is either. And so we're going to look at this passage. We're going to try to explore these ideas here. And if you would join me, it's a long one, but if you would join me either in your Bibles or in the insert in your bulletin as we read Ecclesiastes, starting in chapter 7, verse 15, through the end of chapter 8. So it's a lot. In my vain life, I have seen everything. Right there, you just got a guy who's been, I have seen everything. And he goes on to tell us, there is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. Wisdom gives strength to the wise man more than 10 rulers who were in a city. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. All this your heart knows, I could see, your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. All this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which has been is far off, and a deep, very deep. Who can know it? I turn my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom and the scheme of things, and to know the wickedness of folly and the foolishness of madness. And I find something more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and whose hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, while adding one thing to another, to find the scheme of things, which my soul has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. One man among 1,000 I found, but a woman among all these I have not found. See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, though they have sought out many schemes. Who is like the wise, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the hardness of his face is changed. I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. For the word of the king is supreme, and who may say to him, what are you doing? Whoever keeps a command will know no evil thing, and the wise heart will know the proper time and the just way. For there is a time and a way for everything, although man's trouble lies heavy on him. For he does not know what is to be, for who can tell him how it will be? No man has the power to retain the spirit or power over the day of death. There is no discharge from war, nor will wickedness deliver those who are given to it. All this I observed while applying my heart to all that is done under the sun. When man had power over man to his hurt, then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out from the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also was vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well for those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well for the wicked. Neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear God. There is a vanity that takes place on the earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said that this also is vanity. And I commend joy, for man has nothing better under the sun than to eat and drink and be joyful. For this will go with him in his toil through all the days of his life that God has given to him under the sun. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on the earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep. Then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. That was a lot. I understand that. That was a lot. But I kind of looked at this passage here because it kind of starts and ends with the same idea. Because we have here at the beginning and the closing of this whole idea of this unfairness. It kind of starts in 7:15 and 8:14. We have the same idea repeated slightly differently. In 7:15 it says, "In my vain life I've seen everything. There's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness and a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing." And then 8:14 kind of takes the same idea by saying that there is a vanity that takes place on the earth. Righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. And that's also a vanity. So he kind of starts with the same thing, that there's this unfairness of life. There's people who are righteous, who perish in their righteousness, people who are wicked, who seem to prosper in their wickedness, and there's people who are doing good, who it seems to happen to them as if they were evil, and also vice versa. And so he kind of starts off with this big idea that life is unfair. And life is unfair. If you have raised children, or you were once a child, no doubt your parents told you at some point that life is unfair. I know my parents told me that, and you say, well, that's not fair. And your parents say, well, yeah, get used to it. Life is unfair. And life is kind of unfair at times. Not everything happens the way we would like it to happen. We would like things to be perfectly fine and everything to be even and all these things. And we try. I mean, my generation, we tried. We gave everybody a participation trophy. We gave everybody little things like that to make everybody even. Even now, they've tried to take it so far where I know some little leagues, nobody wins and nobody loses. Everyone just goes out there and plays, and everybody gets a trophy, and it's all just for fun. And nobody wins, nobody loses. It's all totally fair. But it's not really fair, because when nobody wins, then nobody wins, right? Where nobody loses, nobody wins either. And so life is still kind of unfair, because you could go out there and you could be the best team out there and you could hit the home run, you could do all this stuff, but at the end say, oh, it's all good, nobody won. Nobody lost. Don't worry about it. It's like, but I went out there and I worked hard. That's not fair either. And so even when we try to make life fair, we tend to make things unfair, because life is unfair. And that's what he kind of tells us here. And it kind of rings true with what Peck said in his book there, that life is difficult. Life is unfair. Things happen that we do not understand. And these bookends here kind of express a lot of what he says here, because life is unfair. And one of the most fundamental questions, beyond, even seemingly above even this question of why am I here and what's the purpose of all of life, there's an even bigger question that we find ourselves asking, which is, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do bad things happen to good people? That's part of what this passage is trying to get at here. And he's going to get to that life is unfair because life is difficult. Life is unfair. And we tend to think that, well, why did bad things happen to good people? Well, maybe they deserved it. Maybe they brought it on themselves. Maybe there's this one-for-one correlation that you do this, you get this. This is something that we often think when someone is suffering, they go through a thing, well, I guess they had that coming. And Jesus' own disciples thought that. In John 9, 1-2, they passed by a man, they saw a man blind from birth, and they say to him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? What this man must have done something awful, or his parents, that this man was born blind. Who was the sinner here? And Jesus corrects them and says, well, no, actually, that's not really what happened here. This was so that this great miracle could be done. The thought was popular then and even now that however you are in life, your kind of station in life, and the things you get in life is directly tied to how righteous or sinful you are. That righteous people should get more and better, and the sinful people should get what's coming to them. Even Job's friends come out and call out that in Job. The whole reason that Job's friends come to him, and they come and they show up in here, because he has lost everything. The whirlwind has collapsed his house on his kids. He's lost all his kids. He's lost all his livestock. He's lost all his wealth. He's lost everything, and now he's covered head to toe in boils. And it's so bad he's scraping them with shards of pottery because he's just in such agony, and he's lost everything. So that even his wife just says, just curse God and die already, Job. Come on. That's where he is, and his friends come into that scene and say, Job, you must have screwed up real bad. You must have done something to bring this upon yourself. Nobody has seen such wrath of God poured out on a person to lose everything the way that you did. And the scene is kind of comical because we have Job in this, he's out, doing whatever Job does, and some guy runs up, I was just out here, and the marauding people came, and they stole all your camels. And while he was still talking, this other guy comes up, I was just out there, and another group of marauding people came from this other place, and they stole all your cattle. And then this other guy comes, Job, I was just over in the house, and the whirlwind came, and it collapsed on, and all your kids are dead. And it's like, what? And they said, well, Job, you must have done something wrong. Kind of goes with here. Ecclesiastes open, as I say, sometimes that it happens to the righteous people like Job, exactly what you would expect to happen to the wicked. And that we kind of sit there and say, well, yeah, what did Job do to deserve that? And Job's friends come there and say, Job, you have to confess this sin and get over this. And that's the whole thesis of Job. How do we suffer, and how do we look at this? So there's overlap in here. But why do bad things happen to good people? And we're not left in the dark, because it's answered here, and he tells us here, because why is life difficult under the sun? Why is life difficult? Why does life seem unfair? Well, real big simple answer, 3 letters, 1 simple word, sin. Sin, that's why. Because we live in a fallen world. Ecclesiastes 7:20 tells us that surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. There's nobody righteous. So when we ask ourselves, why do bad things happen to good people? Hey, you're fooling yourself, because we're all sinners here. We're all sinners here. And that follows a theme that we find throughout the Bible. Psalm 130 verse 3 says, if you, O Lord, would mark iniquities, who could stand? If you were to mark us all as sinners, who would be standing in the end? Isaiah 46:6 says, we have all become like one who is unclean, and all our righteous deeds are as a polluted garment. We all fade like a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind take us away. That all of our righteous deeds are as filthy rags here. We're all just filled with filth. Paul sums it up in Romans 3:23, a verse that if you've been in church for any amount of time, you've probably heard many times. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Which brings me to a quote I heard long ago, and it stuck with me probably because it rings so true. And if Peck is right, then in the difficulty of life is this huge truth that we have to grasp with, that the simple answer to the question here, why do bad things happen to good people? Well, that only happened once, and he volunteered. Because really, the only bad thing that happened to a good person was when Christ, the truly only perfectly innocent man, was nailed to a cross and died a sinner's death. Why do bad things happen to good people? There are no good people, because we're all sinners. The only person who was truly sinless was Christ, and a bad thing happened to him. And he volunteered for that. So we ask question, we're asking the wrong question here. Why is life unfair? Because we tend to think of ourselves better than we ought. And he gets to that here even when he says in verses 21 through 22, do not take to heart the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that you've cursed others. And that brings me to another quote that I heard. Because if we understand that we're all sinners, this isn't the quote. If we understand that we're all sinners, of course people are going to sin against us. People are going to sin against me. And I've also sinned against other people. This is go through. And there's a quote from Spurgeon that says, brother, if any man thinks ill of you, don't be angry with him, for you are worse than he thinks you to be. And that's what Ecclesiastes is saying here. Don't worry. If someone said something bad about you, don't worry about it. You've said worse things too. All right? And he goes on in that quote to say, if they might get the categories wrong, and they might be saying something that's not true, but if they knew what was in your heart, then they'd only make the picture blacker than it is. Because the truth is that we are all sinners in our heart. And that all of us have sinned things that have entered into our hearts and minds that have never quite made it out to be expressed into our lives. Jesus says that if you think an evil thought in your heart, you've committed murder against your brother. Now, I can tell you that I have thought evil thoughts about people, and someone's cut me off, and I'm like, and things like that. And I've committed murder in my heart, but I've never committed murder with my hands. I've never actually gone out and killed a man. And so that's just an example that, yes, the things that we think and do, if someone knew the real you and all of your heart and the darknesses of your heart, then the things that they would say about you, they might be wrong, but the truth is actually far worse. And so he says, you're going to hear someone cursing you. Don't worry about it. You've cursed other people. You're just as guilty as all of this. And he tells us here in 7:29 that this alone I have found, that God made man upright and he sought out many schemes. God has made man upright, but that we've kind of sought out our own way. We've all pursued sin. And this goes back to the fall. Again, we're all sinners. We were made good and upright, and we abandoned that and our sin to seek it our own way. We all wanted to be our personal Frank Sinatra. I did it my way. That's what we all wanted, and that's what we all sought. Each and every one of us has sought that out. He even tells us here in this kind of strange line here, as it leads into this idea of this mystery, that yes, he tried to seek out all these schemes. He tried to figure it all out, and he could never figure it out. And the only thing that he came out with that was that yes, God made man upright, but we pursued after our own way and our own schemes. And so this first element here, this part of godly life under the sun, is that life is unfair. But it's not really unfair because we're all sinners. We think life is unfair because we don't think of ourselves as sinners. We think of that other guy as sinners. We think, well, that person's a sinner. And in fact, no doubt you've probably sat in church and the preacher has said something about sin and you'd be like, oh, I'm so glad that so-and-so was here to hear that today. And that's how we think. Life is unfair. This thing that happened to me is so unfair. But when that same thing happens to somebody else, you're like, yeah, they had that coming. Life seems unfair. But when you take sin into the equation, it's really not. And so it leads into this idea that life is this mystery, that there's so much to life that we just can't know, because how do we understand all this stuff? Life is unfair, at least it looks that way, but it's not really, and I don't know. And that's what it kind of comes down to, is we don't know. Life is this mystery. And he kind of goes through this all here as he brings us to this idea that we simply, there's so much stuff that we just can't know. We can't know. And we have this tendency, and we were talking about it out here in the Bible study time out here, when we're talking about Isaiah and his great vision of God lifted up as the holy, holy, holy one. And this makes us uncomfortable to really think about that. We don't want to think about God as this holy, holy, holy one. And we want to try to bring God down to some level where maybe he's not that holy. Or we don't bring God down to some level, maybe we can understand it all. I want to be able to understand all this, because we don't like to say, I don't know. I mean, as pastors especially, I have people ask me all kinds of questions, and I'm pretty sure I've said it to a few of you. If I don't know the answer, I'm going to say, I don't know. I've had people who've come and said, why did this awful tragedy happen? And, well, we can say, well, you see, well, no, we don't know. And so, yes, there is this mystery here. And verse 23 introduces that, because he says, in all the searching out, I searched out and I tried to find it all out, but in the end, it's still far off. The more I learned, Solomon is saying here, the more I learned, the more I realized I didn't know. That's biblical wisdom. He says, the more I learned, the more I realized I didn't know. And that's kind of with sanctification too, is the more we try to strive towards godliness and live like Christ, the better we get at that, the more we realize just how far we are from the goal. And that we never actually reach it. There's this mathematical thing, which the terminology doesn't matter, but you have a mathematical equation that ends in this curve, and it curves, and it looks like it's going to touch the line, and it never gets there. Just never gets there. It just gets ever closer, but mathematically it never reaches it. Or if you think about dividing a pizza in half. If I was to have a pizza in front of you and I divide it in half, I can divide it in half and 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 divide it in half. And I can keep on dividing it in half to infinity until we're down to crumbs. And I can divide those crumbs in half. We just keep on dividing in half and infinite. We're never going to run out of things to cut in half. And that's kind of this idea here. Yeah, you can keep on going and going and going, but you're never going to run. You're never going to get there. You're never going to cut that pizza in half and to the point where there's nothing left to cut in half. Even if you're down to splitting atoms and splitting subatomic particles, I mean, there's always going to be something. You're never going to get there. And he realizes that here. He says, I tried to seek out wisdom. I sought this out, but in the end I realized that it's still far off, he says in verse 24. It's very, very deep. It's so far off. Who can find it out? He says this. He says a few times, who can find this out? Who can find this out? This is a great mystery here. And he turns to us, this whole journey started with him saying, I will apply my heart to seek and to search out wisdom, that which is done under the sun. And in chapter 2:12, we had him saying the same thing. I turned to consider wisdom and madness and folly. I'm going to search this all out. And now he's coming to us saying, I searched it all out. But in searching it all out, I realized, and I came to the conclusion that it can't actually be all searched out, because there's no end to it all. The more I know, the more I realize that I'm just a human who cannot actually understand the ways of God and what God is doing, and I just can't do that. The wise man knows what he doesn't know. And this is what helps him to be wise. I mean, if you know what you don't know, and the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And that was the increasing of his wisdom here. The more he increased in wisdom, the more he realized he didn't know. And he tells us a bit about the mystery here. He brings up this idea of a woman whose heart is a snare, and that brings us to an idea that's expressed in Proverbs several times. This idea of a woman whose heart is a snare, the forbidden woman, who's this idea of the sin and the things that seduce us and bring us away from God. And he brings us to the same idea about mankind being incomprehensible in verse 28 and following there, when he says, I tried to find out people. I tried to find out, and I didn't. He says, I didn't find a single woman. This is about searching out. I searched and tried to figure out everything here, and there was not a single woman that I could figure out. And I mean, women, don't feel bad, because he doesn't figure out men a whole lot better, because he only really figures out one man out of 1,000. He doesn't figure out any woman. And the bottom line, I mean, it's not meant to say, well, what's he trying to say here about woman? He's just trying to say, people are incomprehensible. The one man that he no doubt found out was himself. He found out, he doesn't say that here, but I found one man among 1,000 that I figured out. And I didn't figure out any woman. Because people are incomprehensible. And he gives us some wisdom here. He sprinkles some wisdom into here, where he tells us about, keep the commands of God in 8:5. He tells us, keeps this command of God, obey the king in verses 8 through 24. And 6 through 8, he reminds us of truths. Again, he's wrapping things up here. He reminds us of these truths, telling us that there's a time for everything, even our own death, and that this is something that's beyond our control. And he says here in 8:17 that I saw all the work of God, and that man cannot find it out. Again, this is just this big mystery. We can't figure it out. And we have to kind of, in a sense, be okay with that. Kind of like with the life is difficult, and you've got to understand that. Life is a big mystery, and you're not going to be able to figure it all out, and you kind of got to get a hold of that. You have to understand that you're not going to understand everything. And that's what Job understood at the end of Job. In the midst of all his stuff, when he's suffering, and well, why did this happen? And Job says, I demand an answer, God. And he never gets an answer. God comes down and says, this is who I am, Job. And he lays out all of his splendor. And he says, I am the God who did this and did this and did this and put the stars in the sky and the snow and the heavens and all these things. I did all these things, Job. And all Job can say is in Job 40, verses 4 through 5, he says, behold, I am of a small account. What shall I answer to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once and I will not answer. In Job 42 is God kind of comes back with even more stuff, and God says, oh yeah, well what about this? And brings even more examples of his splendor. And Job is left to say, I know you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. And so he's left to just be, yeah, you're God, and I'm not going to be able to figure this all out. So we bow, and we have to submit to the fact that God is God and we are not. I think that's come through all of this teaching here in Ecclesiastes. God is God and we're not. And so we're left with, yes, life under the sun seems unfair. Life under the sun is filled with things that we're never going to fill out. But also, life under the sun isn't everything that there is. And that's where he leaves us. Life under the sun isn't everything. Because this is one of the things that God has revealed, and Solomon was quick to discover, that this life, with all its apparent unfairness and mysteries, is not everything that there is. And this is especially poignant this week as we remember looking back at Easter and the risen Lord who proclaimed to the whole world that death is not the end, because death itself has been defeated in Christ. See, this is a world that's not everything that there is. There's more beyond just this world. That the apparent unfairness and the mysteries of this life isn't where it ends. Ecclesiastes 8, 10 through 11, we read there that I saw the wicked buried. Speaking of the wicked, they used to go in and out of the holy place, and they were praised in the city for all that they'd done such things. So these wicked people, they did all these wonderful things, and everyone said, oh, look at they're great. But they were wicked. He says, this is vanity, because the sentence of an evil deed is not executed speedily. The heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. We see wicked people get away with it, and we say, well, they got away with it. I guess I can go sin too. We see that in our own world, and as things descend and continue to go into more and more craziness in our society and stuff, as we depart further and further from the truths of God and the ways that God would have us live, people say, well, I can go this far, and I wasn't destroyed yet. I guess I can go this far, and I guess no, still haven't been struck down by lightning. I guess I can go this far. And we just keep on going and going and going. But Solomon's telling us here is that, as he tells us in verses 12 through 13, that the sinner who does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, he says, I know it will be well for those who fear God. You might be a sinner who prolongs your life. You might do evil 100 times, but it's not going to be well with you. It's going to be well with the person who fears God. Because even if you look like you got away with it in this life isn't all that there is. Because those who fear God will be the ones who have God in the end. This life isn't the end of it all. He says that it will be well with those who fear God because they fear before him. And this idea of fearing God is understanding God as he is and bowing to him as God. But saying, God, you are God. This sounds redundant in our language, but that Yahweh, creator of the cosmos, I submit to the fact that you are God and that I am a sinner. And this is what you've called us to do. And I come before you in humility to save me. He says, yes, this is who it's going to be well for. That it will not be well with the wicked. Even if he seems to prolong his days, he's not going to get away with it in the end. And that's the answer to all of life being fleshed out here, because at the end of it all, these unfairness, the difficulties, the mysteries, all of this stuff, everything that Ecclesiastes has laid out to us, the vanities of life, the difficulties of life, the unfairness, all these things are summed up with, none of that matters. What is your relationship with God is what it comes down to. And that's what he's going to hammer in these last few chapters here. What is your relationship with God? Because that's what matters in the end, and that's what matters right now. What is your relationship to God? And that's what matters to us, especially if you are in Christ and we live our lives under the sun and in the shadow of the cross and an empty tomb. How do we live our lives now? Who is God to you here and now? And who are you to Jesus? Solomon talked about it as this fearing God, this idea of God, we fear you, and we hold you in this reverent awe of who you are, falling on his mercy for their life. The New Testament talks about it as being born again, turning from sin and becoming a new creation by the power of the Holy Spirit, giving us new life inside of us so that we can call on God as our Father and worship him and be received by the risen Lord Jesus when that day, whatever that day might be, comes, that we die. Because we're going to die. Maybe it comes tomorrow. Maybe it comes today. Maybe it comes 10 years from now, 30 years from now, 50 years ago now, 80 years from now, 100 years from now. Probably just 100 years for my kids. But maybe that day, who knows when that comes? Maybe that day will come, maybe that day comes for you when you don't expect it. He tells us right here that it's going to, you have zero control over the day you're going to die. And we don't like to hear that. That's why we get upset and we panic and I might die from something. We panic. We panic over what might cause us death. But at the end of it all, Solomon makes it very clear here that it doesn't matter how you die because you have zero control over that. What matters, well, ultimately, as a twist here, it doesn't matter how you die. What matters is how you die. Are you in God or not? Are you in Christ or not? Do you have that relationship with God or not? Because in the end, that's all that matters. Life is unfair. It's not going to matter once you're dead. Life is this great mystery, and you're never going to figure it all out. You're going to see God face to face. You can ask him. Life is this mystery. But what's going to matter is, do you have that relation with him or not? That's the godly wisdom for life under the sun. You want to know how to live this life under the sun? Get right with God. Get right with God. That's the wisdom for life under the sun. Because yes, life is difficult. Yes, life seems unfair, and it's a mystery. But the only thing you can control, in all of that stuff, the only thing you can control is right now, who is God to you and who are you to God? That's us as Christians as we live in the light of the shadow of the cross today. So if you join me as we close in prayer.